Hello everyone, I'm Faiza and I'm with the Middle East Institute. I'm here today to introduce to all of you our chairman for this segment, Muhammad Mizanur Rahman, who, as you can see, is the thorn among the roses here. Mr. Rahman is a sociologist by training, and he's currently a research fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore. He was a postdoctoral fellow at the Asia Research Institute and the Department of Sociology, both in the US. And he has had short-term stints as a visiting scholar at the Department of Sociology, University of Western Ontario, Canada, and at the Graduate School of Policy Science, Ritsumeikan University, Kyoto, Japan. He has been commissioned to write research reports on international labor migration in the Gulf and Southeast Asia by the International Organization for Migration, IOM, and the United Nations Development Fund for Women, East and Southeast Asia. Dr. Rahman has conducted field work for his research in a number of countries in Asia, such as the UAE, Singapore, Malaysia, Japan, South Korea, Bangladesh, Qatar, India, Indonesia, and Hong Kong. I hereby give the floor to him. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for your kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back after lunch. Welcome to our session on Asians living and working in the Gulf, a theme that very well ties with the opening remarks by our professor, dear Professor Michael Hudson, Director MEI, and some of the previous panels. As we all know, the unprecedented scale of development projects of the 6 Gulf countries following the 1973 oil boom lead to an extremely rapid increase in the demand for foreign labor. In the 1980s, the number of foreign workers reached 5.2 million, and foreign workers constituted the majority of the workforce in the GCC countries. The number of migrant workers in the GCC countries increased from 9 million in 1990s to an estimated 15 million in 2009. The percentage of migrant stock to total population in the GCC countries is one of the highest in the world, almost 71%. That is all the population in the GCC, 71% are foreigners. There is no doubt that one of the largest labor markets for the Maghreb region, the Mashreq and Asian migrant workers has been that of the Gulf states. There was a considerable population movement among Arab countries in the pre-1973 era. However, the introduction of Asian labor in the post-1973 period marked a shift from the predominance of Arab labor migration to Asian labor migration in the GCC countries. All this migration is mainly temporary migration. Migrants or foreigners are given 2 to 3 or sometimes 5, 10 and renewable visas to work there. So it is basically temporary labor migration. And the beauty of temporary migration is that it benefits both parties, sending countries and as well as receiving countries. The Gulf countries have been immensely benefited by the Asian labor, and Asian labor contributing countries have been also benefited by the Gulf countries in the form of remittances. Numerically speaking, of these 15 million migrant workers in the 6 Gulf countries, as many as 10 million are from Asian countries, especially South and Southeast and East Asia. So, of these 10 million migrant workers have been benefited by the Gulf migration and their families. If we think that every family have 5 members, so if we multiply 10 by 5, it is 50 million people have been directly benefited by this Gulf migration. We have 4 distinguished speakers in this panel who are going to talk about different aspects of Asian migrant workers in the Gulf countries. First of all, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Amy Angell. Dr. Amy Angell is a research fellow at the International Center for Political Violence and Terrorism Research at Nanyang Technological University. She has spent a substantial amount of time working in the Middle East countries, including Iraq, Palestine, Israel, Lebanon, Jordan, and Qatar. She has a PhD in public international law from American University in London. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Amy Angell.
Let me just raise this a bit. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. I'm going to try to be brief, as I was just informed my time should be more 15 than 20, so I will just get started right away. According to UNICEF, there's more than 1/3 of victims of human trafficking come from, pass through, or end up in Southeast Asia. Being such, the Middle East is not usually one of the first places, let alone the GCC states, that comes to mind when thinking about human trafficking and slavery. But if I do my job well, that perception might change. So take, for instance, in fact, some of the most horrific examples of human trafficking and modern-day slavery come from the GCC region. You might remember the 49-year-old Sri Lankan woman who worked as a domestic helper in Saudi Arabia for about 5 months. During that time, she reported that she didn't speak Arabic, and the Saudi Arabian family didn't understand her. So when she did something wrong, the wife would heat up a nail while the husband of the family would insert it into her. When she returned to Sri Lanka, she had 24 nails throughout her body. As you can see from the picture, most of them were in the arms and legs, but there's one even in the forehead. She said that they did this form of torture, as well as the children torturing her with knives, whenever she wanted a break from her 7 days a week, 18 hours a day workload, or she didn't understand what they wanted. Finally, frustrated that they weren't meeting her demands, they dropped her off at the airport, giving her no pay for her 5 months' time and sending her to find her own way home. As of yet, nothing's happened to the family. Or for another perspective, perhaps you might be familiar with the Cyclone Club, located in Dubai. The Cyclone has often been touted as the Disneyland for men. A disco bar at any given hour, over 500 women wait at the door, waiting to service any man who walks through the door. I've interviewed men who have been there and described the situation as nothing short of remarkable. Every size, ethnicity, height, hair color, anything for the liking is there, and the price is negotiable. The female or females, depending on the situation, accompanies the man to a hotel, which generally charges exorbitant rates by the hour. And madams stand in the corner making sure that the money is passed, as well as that the females are engaging and do what the males want. The illusion is so complete, and the men that come in usually end up so drunk that most don't seem to realize, or maybe most don't want to, that the majority of these women are enslaved and forced to work there. Modern-day slavery hidden in plain sight. Fortunately, over a decade, though, the Cyclone Club has been closed at the end of 2007, and according to the government, it's since been converted to a family-friendly establishment. So lured by situations of grandeur and bringing much-needed money back to their families, Asians have been easily lured to be domestic helpers and servants to those in the oil-rich states of the GCC. Unfortunately, as we've come to find out, these visions are often misguided at best. Instead of a safe place where they can work decent hours and make decent wages to send back to their families, individuals often arrive with debts already occurred from their flights and from their meals en route, and must first work off these debts before making any money, if they make any at all. A complex situation, further exacerbated by the fact that accurate statistics on prevalence being relatively elusive and unreliable due to a limited definition of trafficking under international laws, uncoordinated data collection. We have a lot of distortions through the data management, and we have a lot of underreporting of cases. For individuals who are sent in such a situation, if they're fortunate enough to get allowed to escape, if they don't have any money to bring back to their families, or they've been shamed through prostitution, they're less likely to bring their case forward because they're shamed, and oftentimes they're guilt-ridden. They think they've done something wrong. And yet, that human trafficking, as it's defined under international law, subsumes all forms of non-consensual exploitation. That is, whenever people are forced or lured into exploitation, no matter if movement of victims is involved, so no matter if it's within a state or if a person is moved outside of a state, that's considered human trafficking. Yet the fight against human trafficking has been hampered by the lack of common vocabulary and framework for discussing the problem. In this presentation, the term exploitation is used as an overarching theme that subsumes all forms of human trafficking. As you can see here are included men, women, boys, and girls for bonded and exploitative labor, women, boys, and girls into sexual exploitation, women and girls for marriage, boys and girls for illicit adoption. The most comprehensive definition of human trafficking that we have so far was the result of a meeting between governments in 2000 in Palermo. The United Nations Protocol to Prevent, Suppress, and Punish Trafficking in Persons, more commonly referred to as the Palermo Protocol, defines human trafficking as, and you can see it right here, the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons by means of the threat or use of force or other forms of coercion, of abduction, of fraud, of deception, of the abuse of power, or of a position of vulnerability, or of the giving or receiving of payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person having consent over another person for the purpose of exploitation. Exploitation shall include, at a minimum, the exploitation of the prostitution of others or other forms of sexual exploitation, forced labor services, slavery or practices similar to slavery, servitude, or the removal of organs. Put simply, for adults, the process of human trafficking involves recruitment, transportation, harboring, transfer, or receipt by means of threat, force, abduction, fraud, deception for the purpose of exploitation. However, it also notes to be said that individuals under the age of 18, children, the means do not matter. Simply the process for the purpose of exploitation is enough to prosecute individuals involved in trafficking. So I should be clear from this discussion that there are many forms of exploitation, everything from the prostitution to child labor, slavery, indentured servitude, bonded labor, truck systems where supplies are given instead of currency, forced labor, removal of organs, forced marriages, and child abduction and abduction, many mechanisms of which individuals are coerced, though this could be extended almost indefinitely. Now, there are a number of useful resources that you can refer back to. The CNN Freedom Project, that began this year, gives daily updates on different situations of human trafficking around the world, and as well as prosecutions and things being done. Also, ECPAT, the In-Child Prostitution Trafficking, is an excellent resource that goes around the world doing work primarily with children who have been involved in situations of trafficking and slavery. And the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime has now put out an excellent resource which evaluates 155 countries and evaluates what kind of practices they're involved in, what kind of laws are being enacted, as well as the situations at that. All of these resources have been used for this presentation. But one of the most highly regarded reports is the Trafficking in Persons report, called the TIP by the U.S. Department of State. Through a methodology of using U.S. Embassy information, government officials, NGOs, and international organizations, published reports, field trips to the actual sites, and tips given through their emails, they've created a comprehensive report which is published usually every June, so we should have another one coming out here shortly. And for each country, it reviews achievements, weaknesses, lessons learned, laws enacted, criminal cases prosecuted, and it rates the countries on their response to human trafficking by a made public tier system. This tier system is based on the 2000 Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which was established in the United States, officially acknowledging trafficking as a crime and establishing harsh penalties for those involved. The U.S. Department places each country in the report into one of three-level tiers as mandated by the TVPA. The placements is based more on the country's current involvement in the process, if they're making waves to do something about their problem, than it is necessarily about the size of the issue, although the size is also important. And basically, it's the country's response to at least meet the minimum guidelines of the TVPA. And as you can see, like Tier 1 is countries whose government are fully complying with the TVPA's minimum standards for the elimination of trafficking. Tier 2 are countries whose governments do not comply, but are making significant progress to do so. There's also a Tier 2 watch list for countries that in the prior year did make significant progress, but this year, maybe they haven't done anything. Now, any country who remains in the Tier 2 watch list for 2 years consecutively will drop to Tier 3. Tier 3 is the most serious of the tiers, and this is countries who do not comply and who don't really seem to care about complying. And the result of this is penalties, as well as certain sanctions by the US government, in addition to, public embarrassment and condemnation, which some countries have a much more difficult problem with than the sanctions. So as you can see from the map, human trafficking is quite extensive. This is especially the women and children map, because that was the initial primary focus, and it's the Southeast Asia roots. Human trafficking and forced labor are big business. According to the UN International Labor Organization, 12.3 million people are a product of forced labor. Of that total, more than 2.4 have been trafficked across borders. Total profits from the trade add up to $36 billion a year, according to the UN, which ranks it third behind illicit arms and drugs. So that kind of shows you the magnanimity of the problem. However, even those estimates are considered quite modest, according to places like the Not for Sale campaign and the International Justice Mission, which are heavily involved in trafficking. According to them, there's upwards of 30 million slaves in the world today, and the figure is growing. Human trafficking is the fastest growing illicit business, in part due to its high profit and the low criminal prosecution rate. So what I did is I kind of just did a summary of the GCC states that just kind of gives you an idea of the individuals coming out. Most of the GCC states are destination states. They're not supply states, so there's not so many individuals within the states being supplied to others, but rather the opposite. So I'm just going to pick a country to kind of summarize. For instance, Kingdom of Bahrain, it's a destination country for men and women subject to trafficking in persons, especially forced labor and forced prostitution. Men and women from various countries migrate, usually voluntarily, to Bahrain to work as domestic workers or as unskilled laborers in the construction service industries. Around 270,000 foreigners out of a total population of 710,000 live in Bahrain. So it kind of shows you that how important the domestic workers are to their situation. However, many face conditions of forced labor after arriving in Bahrain through uses of such practice as unlawful withholding of passports, restrictions on movements, contract substitution, non-payment of wages, threats, and physical or sexual abuse. A study by the Bahrain's government labor market regulatory authority found that 65% of migrant workers had not seen their employment contract, and 89% were unaware of their terms of employment upon arrival into Bahrain. Many labor recruitment agencies in Bahrain and source countries require workers to pay high recruitment fees. Again, this process which basically the individual arrives already in debt, and it takes at least a year to pay off that debt if they're able to pay it off at all. The study found that 70% of foreign workers borrowed money or sold properties in their home countries in order to secure a job in Bahrain. Finally, women from many countries, as listed on the projector, have been subject to forced prostitution. And here's a few of the others. You see State of Qatar is a Tier 2 watch list for this year, and Kuwait and Saudi Arabia are Tier 3. So Saudi Arabia is a destination country for men and women subject also to trafficking, especially forced labor. Men and women, again, often voluntarily travel to Saudi Arabia as domestic servants or other low-skilled laborers, but once they arrive, they often find involuntary servitude, including restrictions on movement and communication, the withholding of passports and other travel documents, threats, physical or sexual abuse, and non-payment of wages. In some cases, arriving migrant workers have found the terms of employment in Saudi Arabia are wholly different to what they agreed to in their home countries. The Indian government no longer permits its female nationals under age 40 to take jobs as domestic workers in Saudi homes due to the high incidence of physical abuse from employers. Women, primarily from Asian and African countries, were believed to have been forced into prostitution in Saudi Arabia, and yet many Saudis, including some government officials, continue to deny certain kinds of trafficking occur, particularly cases involving sexual exploitation. So as you might have noticed, there are several negative reoccurring themes with human trafficking in the GCC states: the withholding of passports, the non-payment of wages. So what's going right? Well, there are quite a number of promising initiatives in the right direction, of which I'll just highlight a few. I'm sure you're mostly aware of the case of the camel jockeys. Mostly from Pakistan and Bangladesh, these children were kidnapped or sold by their parents to traffickers who take them to the Persian Gulf states, including Kuwait, Qatar, Oman, and the UAE, to work as camel jockeys. The children are generally between 3 and 7 years old and are malnourished to keep their weight down, under 35 pounds. They suffer physical abuse from their traffickers, and they're made to train the camels daily. And many of them have suffered quite serious injuries from falling off the camels during races and even death. So it's great anticipation that one of the most important laws in the region came via the UAE on July 6, 2006, a federal law that prohibits persons below age 18 from participating in camel races and subjects violators to imprisonment and financial penalties. The government also worked with UNICEF, repatriating over 1,000 camel jockeys back to their home and following through to make sure that they were taken care of. In July 2009, Qatar also signed into law a similar provision, introducing electronic jockeys, as shown in the picture, to replace the use of young boys. The Omani government made clear progress with Royal Decree 126/2008, a law combating human trafficking, finding any violators subject to 3 to 15 years of prison term, in addition to financial penalties. And as a result of that law, last year they inspected almost 2,300 places of employment, representing about 40% of the expatriate workers in Oman, to follow through on that. Saudi Arabia's 2009 anti-trafficking law is the first of its kind for the country, and Article 2 repeats the international definition of trafficking. We also have annual reports. In 2007, the UAE started publishing an annual report. It formed a national committee to combat human trafficking, and it highlights the country's stand on the crime, efforts to counter it, progress made, obstacles encountered, and plans for the future. There's also, for rehabilitation, reintegration, that's an area that still needs to be done. It's not enough to just send the individual back to the country. Something needs to be done. So they've placed identified trafficking victims into government-run shelters, and Qatar is also a new rehabilitation center for victims of human trafficking. Conferences, Bahrain hosted its first human trafficking conference in March 2009, and other countries have pledged to do the same. And also there's been an increasing amount of trainings in the area for public officials and for government officials in identification and what to do. And hotlines. Oman, Qatar, and Bahrain have all established hotlines in multiple languages, in addition to airing public on television and radio. So to wrap up this presentation, I'd just like to say that while the steps being taken in the GCC states are commendable, there's still a lot left to be desired. Fighting human trafficking is not a static exercise. A trafficking law or declaration made one year must be implemented and improved the following year. It's not just enough to make the law and then put into action. Likewise, lessons learned should be built on, and best practices should be examined and utilized to the benefit of other nations. Wide disparities between numbers of trafficking victims identified and trafficking offenders prosecuted should be reviewed with the goal of improving the capacity of law enforcement responders to deliver justice to victims. Too often, the victims of this crime are perceived to be society's throwaways: prostitutes, runaways, the poor, racial or ethnic minorities, members of low caste, or recent immigrants. Victims themselves do not know the legal definitions of this crime and should not be required to self-identify. Bias against the vulnerable classes and an inability to envision them as victims affects whether they are identified and whether their traffickers are brought to justice. This is unacceptable. Combating human trafficking requires the expertise, resources, and efforts of many individuals and entities. It's a complex, multifaceted issue requiring a comprehensive response of government and non-government entities in areas such as human rights, labor and employment, health and services, and law enforcement. It requires partnership among all of these entities to have a positive impact. Partnerships basically augment efforts by bringing together diverse experience, amplifying messages, and leveraging resources, thereby accomplishing more together than any one individual or sector would be able to do alone. There's also need to have better agreements between countries when traffickers are found operating in one to extricate him for punishment back to his country of origin. With states requiring sponsorship, there needs to be better sponsorship accountability. What happened to the Sri Lankan domestic servant, and many like her, many whose cases will never come to light, should never have been allowed to happen? To conclude, the Gulf states have taken commendable initiatives to counter human trafficking. at the domestic as well as the regional and international level. But let us hope they don't stop there, because reiterating the fact that human trafficking is an organized crime activity, it needs to be treated as such. Okay, just one paragraph. The situation requires careful handling at different levels, and it should be understood that no short-term measures are a solution. An integrated approach, which combines both short-term measures and long-term strategies, and is aimed at creating grassroots-level public awareness, providing a solid support structure by the state, creating pools of resources to deal with the major problem of economic impoverishment, improving law and order instruments, and pursuing a joint international strategy are most required to deal effectively with this problem, and perhaps most importantly, to give dignity back to the victims of human trafficking and modern-day slavery. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Angell, for a very insightful presentation. Now we are reserving questions to the end after all speakers' presentation. Our next speaker is Dr. Neha Vora. She's an assistant professor at Texas A&M University. She received her PhD in anthropology from the University of California, Irvine, and her research interest is forms of citizenship, belonging, and exclusion within the context of Gulf countries. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome.
This is intimidating. Okay. I'm just going to read. I don't have a PowerPoint, but thanks for coming. Okay. At the beginning of this century, Dubai erupted onto the world stage as a media and tourism spectacle. A small emirate that had transformed from an ancient mercantile port into a global city in a matter of decades, it was breaking world records in luring tourism and investment with islands in the shape of palm trees and over-the-top hotels, luxury hotels and shopping malls. At the beginning of the millennium, Dubai seemed to many to exemplify what Jean and John Komaroff have described as millennial capital, a neoliberal fantasy world of consumerism and real estate speculation built upon the backs of a transnational, transient, majority proletariat population. The plethora of metaphors that have been used in the last few decades to define Dubai mark it as an exceptional place of capitalist excess with no room for the ordinary or mundane. Dubai has been dubbed a Disney World, Las Vegas in the Arabian desert, plastic Arabia, sinister paradise, Singapore of the Middle East, gilded cage, dreamscape, and kingdom of bling, to name but a few. All of these descriptions intimate a place that is fantasy, not reality, lacking of enduring character, and built upon a mixture of hope and greed. Based on these representations, one could argue that Dubai is the classic example of the highs and lows of neoliberal capitalism in this century. The human elements of the city seem to exist at extremes which serve to further exceptionalize the emirate and present it in primarily economic, market-driven terms. Wealthy and exploitative Gulf Arabs and international business tycoons on one end, and downtrodden construction workers and maids on the other. In fact, the majority of attention to South Asians and other migrant groups in the Gulf, both popular and academic, is interested either in the lack of human rights afforded to migrant workers or the absence of forms of civil society in the authoritarian Gulf states that disenfranchise both foreigners and citizens alike, albeit in different ways. The crux of the millennial story about Dubai, then, seems to be one of a new form, or what the Komaroffs call a second coming, of rampant neoliberal capitalism, with both its spectacles and abuses. I argue in this paper that these economically driven narratives of the city as a site of capitalist exceptionalism are both incomplete and also serve to erase the very human elements to which they are often attempting to draw political attention. In fact, Marxist or millennial arguments about Dubai subsume Gulf migration histories into a narrative of oil discovery, eliding the multiple forms of governance and citizenship that actually exist on the ground, and erasing the possibility of migrant belonging. In effect, colluding with, rather than contradicting, the interests of Gulf states. The predetermined conclusion that oil, and more recently post-oil development, is the sole driving force of Gulf economies, migration patterns, and state structures, is echoed in political economic writing about the region. The analytic of rentier state, through which countries like the UAE are approached in this scholarship, effectively presumes and reifies certain ontological divisions, such as market and nation, pre- and post-oil, citizen and non-citizen, liberal and non-liberal. The presumptions built into describing the supposed rentier state and its history remove attention from the ways in which these categories are messy, overlapping, porous, and contested on the ground, and in so doing impoverish our understandings of daily life within the UAE and Dubai. Studying migration in the Gulf through the lens of labor, focusing on human rights, coping strategies, remittances, or slavery, for example, effectively simplifies migrant lives into solely economic forms and removes the possibilities of community formation, cultural hybridity, emotional attachment, consumption, leisure activity, and other forms of belonging from South Asian experiences in the Gulf. Thus, migrants are often written out of the possibility of belonging to Gulf cities before we can even ethnographically explore their own understandings, narratives, and affects of the places where they sometimes spend the majority, if not all, of their lives. To avoid these pitfalls and to highlight the ways that migrants are members of society who contribute to the formation of urban space, Sharon Nagy uses the term foreign residents to describe non-citizens in the Gulf. This naming does not recuperate autochthonous notions of belonging and allows us to interrogate how multiple sets of residents experience and produce the city. In addition, a focus on the daily lives of foreign residents that moves beyond labor challenges top-down categorizations of Gulf countries as rentier states that presume certain historical trajectories, economic structures, and forms of governance, in favor of studies that attend to the specificities and contradictions of transnational migration in contemporary Gulf cities and the potential resonances they may have with urban spaces that are deemed dissimilar in the political economic literature. In today's paper, I want to pose a seemingly impossible and perhaps provocative argument that Indians, a group of people who cannot actually become legal citizens, are in fact the quintessential citizens of Dubai. Dubai's most typical residents are the middle class, working class, and to some extent elite Indians who populate the downtown neighborhoods of the city surrounding the Dubai Creek, but they are mostly erased in contemporary accounts of the Emirates' rise and fall. Dubai, and particularly the neighborhoods that constitute my field sites, is predominantly South Asian, as is indexed by the linguistic, religious, sartorial, and commercial forms visible in the city, like we saw in our film at lunch, for example, as well as by its demography. The majority of Dubai residents hail from South Asia, and of this population, Indians form the largest national group. Additionally, South Asians comprise the main workforce of the private and public sectors of the city at every level of skill set, salary, and education. The entanglements between the Gulf and South Asia mean that in many ways Dubai is experienced as an extension of the subcontinent for residents of the city. While the Emirati government considers foreign residents temporary guest workers, the South Asian-dominated neighborhoods around the Dubai Creek have been flourishing since before British imperialism in the region, and many foreigners are into their second, third, or even fourth generation in the emirate. Thinking about Dubai not as one bounded space, but as a city full of many potential field sites, brings daily life for Indian residents in these neighborhoods into relief. In fact, their narratives and practices reveal forms of urban citizenship that push against a rigid dichotomy of citizen versus non-citizen and against popular imaginings of Emirati pasts and futures. The process of anthropological field-making is important in order to highlight how spaces themselves are products of social invention and interaction, and that cities, as seemingly bounded entities, in fact contain within them a multitude of spaces that are experienced differently by differently situated actors, but which also interpolate different citizens. The ethnographic research I conducted among Indian communities in my field sites, the older neighborhoods surrounding the Dubai Creek, is not intended as a revelation of some kind of real Dubai that is meant to counter a postmodern non-space of shopping malls and hotels. But nor is it any more fractured or partial than representations of the city that privilege these more hegemonic national, religious, gendered, economic, or ethnic narratives. My research is therefore informed by anthropological and cultural geographical work on cities as spaces of belonging and exclusion. In particular, following scholars like de Certeau, I consider how citizenship is both a technique of spatial organization and how legal categories of citizenship may not map onto forms of lived citizenship that take place at the scale of everyday urban life. Dubai, considered in many media and academic accounts as an exceptional city, is actually similar to many urban spaces around the world that are comprised primarily of non-native bodies, whether they be rural to urban or transnational migrants. In Dubai, then, like in all contemporary urban spaces, the human elements of a city and the geographies and institutions of a place are co-constitutive, and forms of belonging and citizenship take place at several scales beyond the juridical legal definition of nationality. I argue that we need to loosen and multiply the definitions of citizenship that we use in our scholarly explorations of the Gulf. Citizenship is not simply a matter of having or not having legal membership. One does not just exist within this binary formulation. Citizenship at the scale of urban belonging, however, is something that is not legitimized either by the Emirati state or by most scholarly accounts of migration within Gulf cities. Dubai's fleeting and exceptional qualities seem to preclude an inquiry into urban citizenship, particularly in the case of foreign residents, who are tied to temporary work visas and defined by the government as guests. However, for my interlocutors in the field, ephemerality was a constant, enduring, and even expected part of their daily lives. The experiences of Indians in Dubai are built upon decades of living both day-to-day and within firmly rooted communities. El-Sheshtawi writes that the Indian-dominated neighborhoods of downtown Dubai, those that are ignored in the literature and considered exotic by Western expatriates, are highly important, quote, places where everyday life is taking place, end quote, even as they are marked by a lack of permanence. The central paradox that drives my research, then, is how Indians experience, narrate, and perform belonging to Dubai within a state of permanent temporariness. I propose an approach to studying citizenship and belonging that attends to the circulation and practice of multiple forms of governance in contemporary nation states. This approach avoids exceptionalizing particular parts of the world and instead acknowledges that globally and locally circulating vocabularies of economy, belonging, and rights are assembled, disassembled, and reassembled everywhere. This approach does not disavow the specificities of different contexts, but rather resists thinking of them as anomalous, spectacular, or even pathological, as is often the case within representations of Dubai and the Gulf. While rentier states are by definition non-liberal, this is not as much a function of on-the-ground practices, scales, and rhetorics of governance and belonging as it is a definition that is solidified through a convergence of academic literature about Gulf states and official Gulf state discourses themselves. Gulf states tend to narrate themselves as anti-liberal, even as they adopt and proliferate certain practices that could be regarded as neoliberal or even liberal, as well as invest in forms of self-described westernization. The production of differentiated subjects in Dubai relies upon these multiple logics of governance. In Dubai, signifiers of migrant, expatriate, and local circulate widely to mark particular spaces and who can occupy them, who is invisible, who is new and who is old, who is permanent and who is temporary, and which bodies contribute to national development and which ones threaten it. National identity in Dubai and the UAE is dependent upon the production not just of legal, geographic, and cultural divisions between citizen and non-citizen, but also on a division between the nation and the economy, a division that appears obvious but is in fact a purification of a multiplicity of entanglements between the state and its many residents. To produce an imagined community for a relatively new nation, the state narrates Emirati identity through autochthony, projects of heritage, and the elision of pre-colonial and colonial cosmopolitanisms. Economic diversity and migrant labor are represented in state discourses as necessary evils of oil wealth that constantly threaten the long-standing cultural history of Gulf natives. Migrants, therefore, are placed into a timeline in which their existence is solely derivative of oil development. In fact, the effect of national identity as timeless is produced through the presence of foreigners, as there was no cohesive identity even at the formation of the Gulf nations in the second half of the 20th century, and many argue that there still is not today. The migrant through this move is relegated to the sphere of the economic and cannot enter the discourse on Gulf national identity. Neoliberal market models therefore combine with illiberal forms of patronage and welfare to produce the effect of an open global economy and a closed autochthonous nation. This division allows for complementary and contradictory techniques of governmentality that produce citizens as well as non-citizens, belonging as well as exclusion. The result of these processes is the production of certain global or foreign spaces in Dubai and certain local or indigenous ones. The nation and those that are seen to embody it is defined precisely against a global economy that is driving Dubai's diversification away from oil, producing its image as a center for mega development and tourism, and threatening Emirati culture through its continued need for foreign workers. However, if we shift our gaze to consider how governmentality also produces foreign resident subjects who also circulate class, religious, and ethnic understandings of membership from their transnational and national backgrounds, we can see that the Emirati state actually relies upon several discourses of citizenship that seem contradictory but serve to produce its legitimacy. Expatriates are welcomed into the UAE and policed within the UAE through technologies and rhetorics of a free and open market that purportedly allows anyone to succeed if they perform neoliberal self-enterprising subjectivities. While migrants, like low-wage workers housed at the edges of the city limits, are deemed insignificant and invisible to the fabric of the city-state. While most residents of the city are considered to fall into this triptych of local, expatriate, or migrant, my interlocutors, the spaces my interlocutors inhabited, and their everyday practices of belonging were not easily contained by these categories and thus revealed their tenuousness. Indians in downtown Dubai did overwhelmingly espouse discourses of neoliberal entrepreneurship that made Dubai a favorable location for immigration, and they were supposedly able to belong to Dubai's market without any challenges to Emirati or Indian national identity. While they disavowed Emirati social and political membership, however, they also staked claims to Dubai through historical memory, racialized identifications, urban belonging, and cultural proximity between India and the UAE. I'm almost there. Therefore, the lived experiences of middle-class Indians in downtown Dubai contained within them not only neoliberal market-based narratives, but also scales and forms of citizenship that extended beyond accounts of voluntary, temporary economic migration. For example, in the larger book project upon which this paper is based, I explore Indian merchants' claims to building Dubai and their nostalgia for masculine spaces of trade and smuggling along the Dubai Creek. I also examine consumer citizenship among Dubai's Indian diaspora, where the consumption of certain products and brands produces identities that stake claims to Dubai as home. And I describe forms of racialization and politicization that emerged among Indians in Dubai from their direct experiences of social hierarchy in workplaces and in universities, what they themselves often called second-class citizenship. This is my last paragraph, promise. While their legal status places them squarely outside of the Emirati nation, my research findings indicate that Indians in Dubai are integral to the legitimacy of the Emirati state, to national identity and citizenship, and to the functioning of Dubai's liberalized and globalized market forms. They are, therefore, I argue, impossible citizens. While the guests at the Burj Al Arab and the guest workers of Sonapur, Dubai's largest labor camp, have captured our attention thus far, they are not indicative of an entire city, nor are they markers of a two-dimensional form of globalization. Dubai is not a non-place without culture or a city of smoke and mirrors. The Anthropologist Project, put as simply as possible, is one of narrating the ordinariness of a place. My ethnographic intervention addresses the ephemerality of Dubai not as fantasy or obscenity, but rather as a quite mundane and therefore anthropologically very important aspect of life for Indian foreign residents, the exceptions to citizenship that are the most representative citizens of this urban space. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Neha. I am very pleased to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Gwenn Okruhlik. Dr. Gwenn Okruhlik is a visiting scholar in the Department of Political Science at Trinity University. She received her PhD from University of Texas, Austin. Dr. Okruhlik specializes in the politics of Middle East with a focus on Arabian Peninsula. She has worked in Egypt, Lebanon, UAE, and primarily Saudi Arabia. She has published extensively in the international and regional journals. Her recent book is a very interesting book entitled Political Change in the Arab States Stuck in Transition. Please.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? I want to extend my thanks to Professor Hudson and to the staff at the Middle East Institute for hosting this fine conference of both scholars and practitioners, and I hope you make it an annual tradition. There are 14 million documented foreign workers in the GCC. There are millions more undocumented workers. Some estimate 60% of the population is foreign nationals. These dynamics make for really complicated self-definitions. This demographic imbalance plays out in the politics of citizenship. I'm interested in the ways in which overwhelming dependence on the other for your own prosperity affects perceptions of belonging to the nation. I find this question especially interesting in the newly globalized spaces, things like the new economic cities, the free trade zones, the meta-construction sites that dot the Gulf. These are all sites of tremendous capital, global capital, and largely structurally disadvantaged populations. So what happens is that these new globalized spaces become strategic sites for new economic processes, new types of actors, and maybe new forms of membership. Questions about whether you integrate or distance foreign labor are provocative here. And I think this is because local populations and local governments are still struggling with the meaning and the content of the rights of national citizenship in an old-fashioned territorial nation-state, even as these globalized spaces are evolving far beyond that construct. I want to focus today on some of the more complicated and interesting aspects of dependence on foreign labor. There are 4 subjects I will address. Perceptions of cultural insecurity. I want to call attention to a category of worker that's often understudied and oversimplified. I want to relate workers to the Arab Spring, or as Greg calls it, the winter of discontent, and talk about new forms of membership. If time allows, I'll talk about analytical cautions. Foreign labor is now a permanent feature of these countries. Many have quietly admitted the failure of their decades-long efforts to nationalize the workforce. Dependence is no longer a temporary phase of development. So the question then is not how to get rid of them and employ our own nationals, but rather how to manage them. They are here to stay. There are practical concerns like housing and healthcare and safety, wages and sponsorship, but there are also very complicated political and cultural implications about interaction and distancing. Dependence on the other for your own prosperity plays out in very interesting ways here. In earlier work, I delineated 7 modes of distancing. Briefly, distance can be social, it can be costumed, gendered, it can be physical space between populations, financial, legal, or institutional. What these 7 distances reflect, though, is a perception of cultural insecurity, or a threat from the other. Thus, you keep them separate and distinct from yourself. Through all these distances, workers are clearly marginalized and vulnerable, especially the masses of unskilled laborers. But I think what is really interesting lately is that nationals also feel increasingly marginalized. What I want to emphasize then is what we see as a mutual perception of marginalization and vulnerability. Longva called it besieged empowerment. She looked at Kuwaitis and said that they felt under threat in their own country. Paul Dresch discusses urban mythologies in the UAE, and he says a salient urban myth is that local children are growing up knowing only how to speak Tamil or Tagalog, but not Arabic. The UAE has articulated a cultural diversity policy derived from a fear of reliance on a single nationality. The labor minister explained, "We want to protect the minority, which is us." The UAE also requires a cultural knowledge test for residency. The Bahrain labor minister has been outspoken and said, in some areas of the Gulf, you can't tell whether you're in an Arab Muslim country or in an Asian district. No nation on earth can accept an erosion of its own culture on its own land. He went further to say expatriate workers are eroding the national character of the states of the Gulf. And in Saudi Arabia, the former labor minister said, "We do not want the day to come when we're forced to allow the foreign workers to be represented in our parliaments and our municipal councils." This sense of threat plays out through distances. The feeling of being hemmed in by foreign workers leads to more rigid assertion of self by locals of their own national identity. As Gulf nationals experienced unemployment, foreign laborers came to be seen either as competition or simply as scapegoats. Let me demonstrate this recent increase in antipathy and threat anecdotally. In the UAE, we hear Gulf states are going to be like the Aborigines, or Gulf state Arabs, rather, will be like the Aborigines. We'll be the native Arabs, just like the Native Americans, on whom alien traditions and values were imposed because they were in the minority. Or, look, this is why we're such sticklers about our national dress. This is why every civil servant is obliged to wear it to work. From Dubai, Chris Davidson has written that nationals feel unwelcome in parts of their own cities and complain that hotel managers actually discriminate against national dress. One shopping mall in the UAE bans foreign workers from entering on evenings and weekends, and they must use the rear entrance as well. In Whither, you hear, the priority always goes to the foreigner. But listen to the implied subtlety in this comment. We are a minority. Our traditions are threatened. Arabic is no longer our first language. We are surrounded by foreigners, and we live in constant fear for our children because of drugs and crime. There are lessons and arguments, I think, to be derived from this perception of threat. Listen carefully to the statement of the Ghattari. We are surrounded by foreigners and live in fear for our children because of drugs and crime. Notice the very easy slippage between a perception of cultural threat and crime. This is important. There's a fine line between nationalism and protecting your national interest and xenophobia or racism, especially under conditions of overwhelming dependence. When expatriates become the target of humiliation and antipathy, this reflects an attempt to reassert the boundaries between locals and foreign workers. Now, the flip side of this is that we also see an upswing in Turath, or pride in one's heritage. There are more cultural festivals, more symposiums, more publications, all designed to give substance to the idea of our national shared heritage. Okay, let me muddy this up a bit and build on Nora's comments. I want to draw attention to a category of worker that is vastly understudied and oversimplified. And these are the multi-generation migrants. The realities of hundreds of thousands of migrants who are, in fact, in semi-permanent settlement. These are multi-generation extended families that come from other Arab countries, Iran, Pakistan, India, or Bangladesh. They were born in the Gulf, raised in the Gulf, schooled in the Gulf, they got married in the Gulf, and now they're raising their own children there. They're middle and working class. They run half of the small business establishments in the Gulf under the sponsorship of another person. Khalid al-Ma'ina estimated that in Saudi Arabia there are 2 to 3 million expats who've been born in Saudi Arabia. He says, these are second and third generation workers. They live as Saudis, they learn as Saudis, they pray as Saudis, yet they have no identity and no citizenship. They know no other home. Even the lands of their ancestry are foreign to them. And Sharon Naji has studied these entrenched communities and talked about distinctions between and within communities. My point is that these multi-generation worker communities are forming communities in diaspora that are intricate and deep and complicated, even when they exist in a larger social political environment that's hostile towards their permanent settlement. I think the argument about foreign workers being a cultural threat is much more difficult to make about multi-generation foreign labor communities. After all, they've been there for 30 to 50 years. They run the small businesses. Let me step back for a couple of minutes and talk about workers during this Arab Spring. Historically, in the Gulf societies, we all know that the usual and troublesome class distinctions did not develop. It was substituted by the cleavage between expatriates and locals. That's changing. While the local expatriate distinctions still remain, there are class distinctions in at least Saudi Arabia, Oman, and Bahrain. And this development has been brought to the fore with the recent Arab uprisings. So amid the petitions being presented to ruling families and protests in the streets, what we now see are citizen worker strikes. In Saudi Arabia, there were weeks of silent worker protest. Men just stood silently outside of ministries in Riyadh, their arms folded, just like this. Not saying a word, standing in their starched white thobes and their perfectly folded keffiyehs. was very different from the images of Tahrir Square with music and placards and slogans and emotion, but it was very effective. There was a sit-in in front of Saudi Telecom in Riyadh, where people were seeking pay raises to keep up with the cost of housing. 80% of the staff at power generation stations across the country joined the strike. They had their own Facebook site. In Oman, there were strikes for higher wages and more jobs in Muscat, Salalah in the south, Sur in the east, and Bahraini by the UAE. There were citizen worker strikes at Oman Air, the Petroleum Development Company, Bank Muscat, the Oman Investment Finance Company, and their Intercontinental Hotel. In Bahrain, economic class and sect overlap. Sectarian discrimination means that there's social inequality. We saw strikes across the country. An estimated 70% of the workers were out. This doesn't mean they were in Lulu Roundabout. It means they were not working. So it profoundly affected the economy. Gulf Air, the energy industry, the public sector, the stock market, and the financial centers were all severely disrupted. And just last week in Kuwait, the vice president of the Workers' Union of private oil sector companies threatened worker strikes and sit-ins if worker demands are not met. My point is this. Foreign worker strikes are relatively recent, the last 10 years or so. Citizen worker strikes are new. Only the UAE and Qatar have been able to avoid internal class distinctions, and I find this really interesting because, of course, those two states have the highest percentage of foreigners, but they're still able to employ all their citizens in the public sector. As citizens rose up to demand their civil and political rights and representation, so too have foreign workers been on strike in the Gulf. Let me highlight a few very quickly. In Kuwait, more than 1,000 Badoon protested after Friday prayers, demanding at first their civil documents, but later human and civil rights and then citizenship. In Saudi Arabia, hundreds of workers at King Abdullah Financial District walked off their jobs, and at King Saud University extension projects. The Bin Laden group lost more than 600 workers at a construction site close to the mosque in Mecca. And the King Abdulaziz Endowment Project is a massive project that includes the clock tower and 5 towers and a courtyard expansion, also had massive worker strikes. In the UAE, 3,000 Arab tech workers went on strike for their wages. This was all during the Arab Spring. In Bahrain, there were rumors that workers from Bangladesh and India were forced to participate in pro-government rallies. Now, that has been officially denied, but the rumor was circulated widely. So let me tie these ideas together. There's this one literature on increasing distance and regulations. There's another literature on integration and assimilation. So I was puzzled, and I struggled with these very divergent interpretations of the same empirical reality. And I've concluded that, in fact, there are two processes occurring simultaneously. Direction and actor are key. From above, the state is regulating and distancing. But from below, foreign workers are, in fact, forging networks of community and survival. The Badoon and multi-generational workers know no other place. So there is social integration from below. In other contexts, people talk about citizenship without community. But I think what we're seeing in the Gulf is community without citizenship. Might forms of national community develop that distinguish between citizens and other members that have some legal protection but fewer rights? Perhaps down the road what we're talking about is marginalized citizens. Just as there are hybrid forms of power and authority that are beyond states and beyond markets, so too I think there are going to be hybrid forms of citizenship and membership that will take form and content in the demographic imbalance that we see in the Gulf. Thank you.
Thank you, Gwenn. Our last speaker is Dr. Attiya Ahmad. She is an assistant professor at Wesleyan University, USA. She received her PhD in anthropology from Duke University. Her work focuses on interrelation between gender transformation of labor and economic relations, transnational migration, religious movement in the Gulf and Indian Ocean.
Okay, thank you very much. And first and foremost, I'd like to thank the MEI team and NUS for organizing such a tremendous conference. I'm so delighted, honored, and grateful to be here. The title of my paper today is Conversion to Islam or Becoming Muslim, How Dawah, Domestic Work, and South Asian Migrant Women in Kuwait Point to the Importance of the Household. I begin with an excerpt from my field notes. There we were, an unlikely trio, sitting on a bench outside our Salah wa Tahara, our prayer and purification class during break. Sophia, a Nepali Hindi-speaking woman, Noura, a Goan English-speaking woman, and myself, a Canadian-Pakistani ethnographer and frequent multilingual go-between. Sophia and Noura were speaking in Arabic, reveling in newfound sounds and expressions, which gave me a moment of pause, a moment to absorb our surroundings and our conversation. The heat was unbearable, as summer days in Kuwait are wont to be, and though beads had long since turned to sweat, neither Sophia nor Noura made any move or gesture to hint they wanted to go back into the cool air conditioning of our class. It was simply too noisy and their conversation too engrossing. Noura was telling Sophia about her mother's response when she told her she had taken Shahada, the Islamic testament of faith. Dumbfounded, her mother could only splutter out a question, further mangled by the telephone reception. Quote, "You are converting and turning from our Lord Jesus?" Sophia's response to this, in turn, dumbfounded me. Quote, "That's no problem. Explain to her you are becoming Muslim, not converting." So what is the difference between converting to Islam and becoming Muslim? Over the course of conducting ethnographic fieldwork on South Asian migrant domestic workers in Kuwait who are adopting Islamic precepts and practices, this difference cross-cut many of my conversations. Initially, I dismissed this issue, believing it simply to be a question of semantics, of different terms being used to refer to the same phenomena. However, after mapping out the utterances and experiences of my interlocutors, domestic workers, as well as their Kuwaiti employers, individuals and groups involved in Kuwait's domestic work sector, and teachers and women participating in Kuwait's largest Islamic Dawah movement, I came to realize that this difference indexed and instantiated two fundamentally different and incommensurable explanatory frames through which migrant domestic workers' newfound pieties are understood. In this paper, I map out these two explanatory frames, contrast them with how domestic workers discuss their own experiences, and discuss how they all foreground the importance of the household as a site through which transnational domestic labor migration and globalizing religious movements are reconfiguring social belonging and political possibilities in our contemporary world. So first, some background. Flush with petrodollars, over the past 30 years, Kuwait has become an important second-tier destination for migrant domestic workers from South and Southeast Asia, and more recently, East Africa. During this period, the number of domestic workers has increased by over 1,200% in Kuwait. Of varying ethnic, national, linguistic, educational, and religious backgrounds, in Kuwait, these women share a common set of experiences. Whether cooking, cleaning, or caring for children and the elderly, the gendered labor they perform is crucial to Kuwaiti social reproduction. 1/6 of the total population and employed in over 90% of households in Kuwait, they are a ubiquitous part of Kuwait's social landscapes, but one that is largely disregarded. As scholarship on domestic workers in the Arab Gulf states and Asia more generally has underlined, migrant domestic workers are situated in an uncertain structural position. Falling outside the purview of existing labor laws, market calculations, kinship networks, and citizenship rights and entitlements, yet integral and intimately imbricated in their employers' everyday lives, domestic workers occupy a precarious space of indeterminacy, of both belonging and exclusion. While existing scholarly literature has understandably focused on and drawn much needed attention to the precariousness of domestic workers' situation, this focus has by and large largely overshadowed discussions about other dimensions of these women's experiences of migration. When it comes to domestic workers' newly developing practice of Islam in Kuwait, it is striking how little attention has been paid to this relatively widespread phenomenon. Over the past decade, tens of thousands of domestic workers in Kuwait, some estimate as many as 35,000, have taken Shahada, the Islamic testament of faith, making them the largest group of foreign residents and migrants to adopt Islamic precepts and practices. Despite the scholarly silence, in Kuwait, their newfound pieties have generated a great deal of boisterous public debate. These discussions center on one question: why? Why are these women adopting Islamic precepts and practices? Over the course of conducting research in Kuwait, two explanatory frames were often presented to me. The first explanatory frame is one consistently used by Kuwait's foreign resident population, members of Kuwait's self-styled liberal movement, local and international human rights organizations, labor agencies, foreign embassies, and domestic workers' families and communities of origin. This explanatory frame focuses on different causal factors leading migrant domestic workers to change their religious belief, practices, and identities and convert to Islam. Some argue macro factors best explain these conversions. Domestic workers migrate because of worsening economic conditions in their places of origin, and they go to Kuwait because of its booming petrodollar-fueled economy. In Kuwait, their immersion in an overwhelmingly Muslim milieu leads some of these women to convert. These conversions are further encouraged and facilitated by Kuwait's Islamic Dawah movement, which has expanded its activities in the face of a burgeoning non-Muslim population in Kuwait and developed links with Islamic groups and domestic workers' places of origin. Others point to micro-experiences to account for why domestic workers convert. Domestic workers' everyday engagement with Islamic precepts and practices leads some to develop newfound pieties. Alternatively, domestic workers convert in order to receive better remuneration or treatment from their employers. Though they point to two different scales and registers, sort of macro factors versus micro experiences, political, economic, structural processes versus individual motivation, these analyses are strikingly similar. Both are predicated on a priori distinctions drawn between different religious traditions and between religion and political economy. With respect to the latter, the relationship between religion and political economy is articulated through linear cause-effect relationships. Now, the second explanatory frame is predicated on ethical forms of reasoning and focuses on processes by which domestic workers become Muslim through their engagement with Islamic precepts and practices. Among members of Kuwait's Dawah movement and migrant domestic workers who are becoming Muslim, being Muslim is conceived in fundamentally processual terms. One is not simply a Muslim, one must be Muslim, and being Muslim is something both new and old Muslims must constantly actualize, enact, and produce. One becomes and is in a state of constantly becoming Muslim by learning Islamic precepts and practices and re-engaging with one's life in relation to these. This process is neither unidirectional nor linear, but cyclical and recursive. One apprehends and approaches Islamic precepts and practices in and through cultural meanings and social relations that comprise one's daily lived experience. Proficiency is achieved through constant striving, a constant tacking back and forth between Islamic precepts and practices and the stuff of everyday life through which these precepts and practices are apprehended, approached, and actualized. For domestic workers who are becoming Muslim, this stuff of everyday life necessarily includes their pre-existing religious traditions, their relations with family members in their places of origin, and their laboring and relations with their employers in Kuwait. Becoming Muslim is thus not conceived as a renouncing or a rejection, but as a reworking and re-engagement with one's life. It is a dynamic and encompassing process in which the boundaries between different religious traditions and between religion and political economy are conceived as porous and fluid. Now, both sets of explanations are predicated on incommensurable forms of reasoning. One on causal logic that identifies political economic factors as reasons for domestic workers' conversion. The other on ethical forms of reasoning that posits a situation in which domestic workers become Muslim through their engagement with Islam. These incommensurabilities often lead people to misapprehend or to speak past one another when discussing and addressing the issue of migrant domestic workers' newfound pieties. In addition, these two explanatory frames index and instantiate two competing visions of political practice in Kuwait, those of liberal secularists and Islamic reformers. So groups focusing on domestic workers' conversion to Islam often question the sincerity of domestic workers' conversions, posing questions such as, given the marginal status of these women in Kuwait, can their conversions truly be sincere? Are their conversions self-interested, calculated decisions, or do they convert because of the pressure, implicit or explicit, brought to bear upon them by the families with whom they work? The issue of sincerity is important to these groups' determination of whether or not domestic workers' conversions constitute a political issue. Predicated on secular liberal understandings of governance, in which religious belief and practice is subject to individual choice and is relegated to the private sphere, these groups regard religious conversion as an intrinsically private matter, one that becomes a political issue only insofar as it is brought about through pressure or coercion. In such cases, these groups look to the state or state-like institutions to adjudicate and uphold the rights of domestic workers to their religious beliefs and practices. They recognize, however, how difficult this is in Kuwait, given that domestic workers not only work and reside within their employers' households, but under Kuwait's kafala or sponsorship system, they also obtain their work and residency visa through their employers. Under these circumstances, state intervention would necessitate the expansion of state authority and the fraught reconfiguration of governance between households and state institutions. Now, alternatively, members of Kuwait's myriad Islamic reform and dawah groups viewed domestic workers becoming Muslim as marking their movement's success on two fronts crucial to the development of a rightly guided ummah or community of believers. So their success in reaching out to Kuwait's diverse non-Muslim population and in reforming Kuwaiti families and households. Now, from the mid-1970s to the aftermath of the First Gulf War, the demographics of Kuwait's migrant and foreign resident population, which today comprises approximately 2/3 of the contemporary population, has shifted from being predominantly Arab and Muslim to being largely South and Southeast Asian and non-Muslim. In the face of these changes, the form and composition of Kuwait's Islamic groups have been reconfigured as they have sought to reach out to this growing population and include them in their activities. What began as a series of classes meant to teach interested migrants Arabic, Kuwaiti customs, and to address misconceptions about Islam have proliferated into a diverse, multilingual, and sprawling movement consisting of tens of thousands of newly practicing Muslims, dozens of outreach centers, multiple multilingual mosques, and a panoply of television and radio programs, as well as establishing relationships and joint programs with Islamic groups throughout the world. Now, as the largest group of newly practicing Muslims, domestic workers index the success of this dawah movement. They also point to the movement's success in encouraging pious practice within Kuwaiti families and households, sites that Islamic reformers consider to be of paramount importance to the production and reproduction of Muslim subjects. Now, domestic workers' newfound pieties are seen as both resulting from and further encouraging Islamic practice within the household, what one teacher once described to me as the womb of the ummah. Now, although incommensurable, both explanations of domestic workers' conversion to Islam or becoming Muslim underscore the importance of the household. For groups promoting secular liberal forms of governance, domestic workers' conversions underscore an important limit point to state authority and intervention. Among members of Kuwait's Islamic movements, the household is a point of possibility in their development and of a rightly guided ummah. I'm almost done. So domestic workers' utterances and my own observation of their experiences in Kuwait also suggest the importance of the household, but in ways that contrast with and are not accounted for by general public discourse. Rather than focusing on reasons or explanations on why they were converting to Islam, a question others in Kuwait were preoccupied with, my interlocutors were intent on the question of what their becoming Muslim entailed and how their newfound pieties were developing through the Kuwaiti households within which they lived and worked. To my interlocutors, explanations for why they were converting to Islam were not the point. The significance of their newfound pieties was intertwined with what they referred to as house talk. Rather than marking a rebirth, rejection, or abrupt change in their lives, my interlocutors described their adoption of Islam as a gradual process through which they came to re-engage and rework their everyday relations and activities through Islamic precepts and practices. They often discuss their newfound pieties as part of reconfigurations taking place in their relations with household members in Kuwait and in the places from which they had migrated from. Now, their households were not just sites bookending their transnational migrations and journeys. Rather, their households were dense and vital spaces of work, of affect, of intimacy, of cultural and linguistic dislocation, of economic exchange and distribution, and of asymmetrical relations and loving relationships that animated their transnational movements and experiences. It was in these spaces of everyday activity and interaction through which they gradually came to develop Islamic sensibilities through which they then came to re-experience and rework their households, both in Kuwait and the places from which they had migrated. Domestic workers' experiences mark the confluence of two realms that are often assumed to be distinct: the disciplining and reshaping of migrant domestic workers' comportment, affect, and sense of self related to their undertaking of domestic work, and the everyday cultivation and ethical formation of religious subjectivities related to their engagement with Islam. So undergirded by gendered logics and relations, both these processes are reshaping domestic workers' subjectivities, modes of belonging, and social networks. So in brief, in conclusion, although predicated on radically different and incommensurable assumptions and understandings, all three accounts about why it is South Asian migrant domestic workers in Kuwait are adopting Islam underscore the importance of the household as a site through which the increasing feminization of transnational labor migration in the region and globalizing religious movements are reconfiguring social belonging and political possibilities in our contemporary world. Domestic workers' experiences thus underscore a broader issue: the importance of recognizing and examining the household as a site of vital political importance in and through which diasporas and religious movements are formed and reformed. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah. Now floor is open for Q&A. Please introduce yourself before asking a question. I'll take first 3 questions and then one by one maybe. Yeah, please, Professor Pasha.
Okay, can we, sorry.
Oh, okay, please. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Kevin. First of all, I'd like to congratulate you all on great presentations. I have a broad question for all of you, but first I'd like to ask Dr. Okruhlik. I'm especially interested in whether or not there have been, first of all, thank you for a very inspiring presentation, but I'm also wondering, have there been any cases where there have been like citizen strikes in addition to non-citizen strikes, or there have been communication between like the migrant labor populations and citizen populations, so there's been a sort of shared sentiment? That's my first question. And then the second question, which is directly related to that, sort of for all of you, is what is your sense of this kind of sentiment of, transgressing this like citizen versus non-citizen divide? Like Dr. Ahmad was talking about these multilingual mosques, or are there, what is your sense of on a sort of everyday level, the relationships between citizens and non-citizens? So yeah, I'll just leave it there.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To Dr. Attiya, a very interesting presentation, but I have 2 points. Maybe you could throw some light on it. One is, during the course of your research, have you come across any numbers, country-wise, especially in South Asia, This is number one. And whether this conversion or becoming Muslim, has it changed the relationship between the employer and the migrant women worker? Has it changed the working conditions? Is she perceived differently because she has the same religion like the household members? In other words, is she exploited less? Lastly, as far as Dawa is concerned, is there any sectarian nature in this, either Shia or Sunni, or it is, because nowadays we hear a lot about Iran and its efforts to convert people all over the world. To Dr. Neha, a very interesting presentation. I have been there to Dubai a couple of times. I've seen the temples for Hindus and the Sikh community in Dubai and a small one in Al Ain. But what is the official position for those Hindus who die, natural or otherwise, in accidents and so on and so forth? Is there a proper burial place for them, or the last rites which are conducted to them?
Okay.
And also, just one short question. The Indians have a large number of associations. Especially among the Malayalis I found from Kerala. And most of them I found, are quite democratic. They have elections and participation. Is it your understanding that this democratic and participatory process in the associational elections and the fierce competition which goes to it, given their background in India, especially Kerala, does it impact the workers or the locals also? And to Dr. Ami, have you come across any shelters? Some embassies, I'm told, they have shelters where maidservants, for example, who run away from the employers, who take refuge there. Is there any numbers we are talking about? In one such shelter in Kuwait, I found a 4-storied building maintained by the embassy. At one stage, 500 maidservants were found there. But is it the case in other GCC countries you have concerned, especially in the maidservants? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Gwenn, you want to?
Yeah, Kevin, thank you for your question. That was really interesting. Offhand, I don't think I've seen shared sentiment strikes, but I will look into it. So far, it's been pretty segregated. And I guess one reason is because the labor unions and the worker associations that exist in order to meet the mandate of the ILO really segregate indigenous workers from expatriate workers. So even when they allow in, the great masses of foreign workers, they're not allowed to vote or sit on boards or do anything. So even within the labor unions, they're strictly segregated. Now, on the one hand, it seems like if we were going to see shared strikes, it would be in Bahrain, where both the Shia and the foreign laborers work in some of the lower level positions. So on the one hand, it seems like they would have a shared interest in striking, but on the other hand, many Shia see them as competitors for their livelihood. So I'm not sure how that'll play out, but it's a great question. In terms of, is the citizen-expatriate divide transgressed in life? In the last year, at the intellectual and the level of human rights activists, yes, it is. You do see things like, I think it's Human Rights First in Saudi Arabia and the Association for Civil and Political Rights, sometimes making statements calling for protection of these workers. So at that level, you are beginning to see that divide crossed. In everyday life, it is transgressed in individual relationships. People get by, people live life on the ground. But individual relationships are different from transgressing the structural divide as groups. So it occurs at different levels.
Dr. Neha?
I just wanted to add the question about transgression. I mean, I think that Dr. Ahmad's paper on the intimacies of household interactions is one very important way in which these kinds of these connections and communications happen, as well as we can think about how many foreign marriages there are in the Gulf as well. That's so in a lot of ways, the idea that national identity, like I was saying, is very closed is false. It's based on an ideological kind of need for that to be that way. Dr. Pasha, I believe, right? Am I correct? Okay. So that was a really great question about the Hindu cremation. From what I know, so there's a Hindu temple and then there's a Gurdwara upstairs. It's one unit. It was gifted to the Indian community by Sheikh Rashid, so that they own that space full out. And what I understand from some of the historical readings that I did, that there was space further down the creek for cremation that was like downwind of the central parts of town. I'm not sure whether that has changed and what goes on now. I have a feeling like my memory is like sticking on one thing that I might have read about how there's like indoor cremation facilities now. But I can definitely follow up on that if you'd like. Indian associations as democratic. This is really interesting because I did not find that in my research. Yes, sure, they have presidents and elections and all these kinds of things, but at the same time, the Indian associations were ways in which a lot of merchants, well-off merchants, would organize their business communities. And these associations are not, especially if you looked at like the Haryana clubs and the Jain clubs and Gujarati clubs and things like that. These are like long-standing merchant communities that have been running these kinds of clubs. The newer clubs, like the Bengali clubs and the Malayali clubs, I'm not very familiar with. But what I found is that these clubs actually form the core center through which certain Indian elites consolidated power, and I also found that there's a strong connection between ethnic identity as being the way that you hire and also exploit. So a lot of times, the elites of a particular group who owned a business would then be hiring through the networks back home people from that group as well. So I basically argue in one of the chapters of my book that Indians, through that migrant regulation, are actually acting in the stead of citizens more often than not for the kafala system.
Yeah, Dr. Attiya.
Okay. I'm sort of struggling with an AC cold, so just bear with me if my voice falters. So in reference to Mr. Smith's question that also links into Dr. Pasha's question, so the sense of maybe the transgressive citizens and non-citizens relations. As I did talk about, and as Dr. Vora also mentioned, my research really highlights sort of the intimate everyday imbrications and relationships between domestic workers and their employers. However, the idea that even they interact on a daily basis doesn't mitigate the very gendered race and class relationships that exist between them. And the idea that, through their conversion, that this may somehow redress some of the asymmetries in their relationships. It may, lead to less exploitation. So these sorts of instrumental and utilitarian explanations, which are quite they circulate quite broadly in the Gulf among non-domestic workers who are converting. So there's a popular perception that that is the case, and my research really pointed to the fact that that doesn't happen, that even if they convert, their relationships are still subject to very gendered, raced, class relations with their employers, and it doesn't in any way sort of flatten out these hierarchical relations. With respect to the question you asked about whether there's any numbers, did I understand that correctly? So if there's any statistical accounts or demographic accounts. In general, here we're also hampered by the paucity of statistical and systematic research on these sorts of questions. I will say though that the numbers do fluctuate, according to fluctuations in the demographics of domestic workers in general, which widely varies over the course of a few years. So when I was doing research, there was a sudden increase of Nepali domestic workers despite there being a labor ban in Nepal. And when I returned to Kuwait about a year after I conducted primary fieldwork there, the largest number of women who were migrating to Kuwait to work as domestic workers were from East Africa. And so it really dramatically can change within the span of a couple of years, linked to bans, so labor migration bans, the saturation of markets, the situation in labor-sending countries, et cetera. So I would, if anyone's to conduct research on this, I would definitely encourage them to keep an eye out on the general sort of fluctuations and trends in the demographics of migrant domestic workers. And then the question of sectarianism, yes, Kuwait has a very large Shi'i population. Some estimate that it's a third of the citizenry or even higher. However, the Islamic movement that I did research on isn't necessarily associated with any of these sects, so to speak. They're not associated with any state either, and so both Sunni and Shi'i participate in the organization I researched. If you want to have a broader conversation about, my perceptions and experiences based on on-the-ground research of the relations between Shi'i and Sunni, I'd be happy to during conversation. And I think that was it. So thank you.
Dr. Amir.
And for me to answer your question, percentages of individuals who have been able to escape from exploitative situations, unfortunately, they're quite difficult to come by. For the simple reasons, in most cases, individuals who are in those types of situation, their passports have been seized by the traffickers, in addition to no payment of wages. They've also often been psychologically broke down. So in some cases, there have been individuals who have been sexually exploited, who have been told that their families are going to be harmed if they leave, or or they will kill them if they leave. I mean, there's a lot of psychological breakdown involved in trafficking. But also, even for those who manage to escape without their passport, in some cases where they've gone to police, and told the police about the situation, perhaps they've been forced into prostitution. The police have then turned and arrested them for the criminal fine of prosecution. So there's been also cases where the individuals themselves, in the cases of even if they were smuggled illegally into a country, and they don't have that visa to be in the country. They've also, in those cases where they've escaped, they've been arrested for being there illegally, and we've got a number of individuals in prison for that as well. So there's a lot of problems gaining the statistics, because you've got it's confounded by a number of factors. But I mean that they're becoming increasingly better, especially like the UAE, which is keeping a documented record of all the individuals now through their annual report who have been arrested for trafficking, and they do have increasingly more centers and shelters for individuals. So they're getting better, but they're still not where they need to be.
Yeah, please, for the next round of questions. Yes, please.
Okay. Thank you all. Thank you for your very enlightening presentations. I wanted to bring to your attention that I had been reading an IPS news article when I first came across Dr. Rahman's name, who's now chairing your panel. So it took me to be browsing the internet to find a guy who works on the level above us at the Middle East Institute. But he does have experience in sort of migration and labor movements with Asians living and working in the Gulf. And I'm wondering if he can sort of draw on his own expertise from his base in Southeast Asia to give us some perspectives on the panelists' talks.
Now, to me, as I started at the beginning, that at least 50 million individuals from Asia have been benefited by Gulf migration. And this is very neglected aspect of migration. We talk about trade relations, but we hardly talk about remittance relations. So that is my main concern, actually. And if we talk about the trafficking or some sort of exploitations, we need to see it from the very broader perspective. It's a huge business. Migration is a huge business, and different interest groups are involved in the migration process. It's not only that in the destination country, also the sending countries. And to me, in East and Southeast Asia, what I observe is it's the sending countries where most of the interested groups are based. They are making money out of these innocent migrants. Then they are passed to the destination countries, and where they also go through some ethnic networks, the way Amy and also Dr. Gwenn mentioned. And then there are also some sort of violations that is what is promised is not offered. So this type of things are there, but it's a huge movement of the population, and this is temporary migration. It's inter-Asian migration. It is not like from Asia to Europe for the permanent settlement. It is within Asia for the temporary settlement, for the temporary migration, and their main families left behind, and they are waiting for the remittances. When foreign aid directly goes to the government, then government to different levels, and at the end, I don't know what is the percentage that the people who are desired, who are targeted are actually get. But remittances, it goes directly to the pockets of the people who really need it. So maybe we should look at that aspect, and also be thankful that we not only talk about the trade relations, also the remittance relations and the people-people relations. But I will be happy to receive more questions about our distinguished speakers and know their experiences. Please, if anyone is interested. Hopefully not to me.
Okay. Well, it does relate to Singapore. And Dr. Angell, you work in Singapore, so maybe you're well placed to answer this, I'm not sure. But if you could maybe compare the migrant workers that work here in Singapore. As we all know, there's a very large migrant labor population, and this is part of what has made Singapore so incredible. But of course, this comes with a swath of problems. In the Straits Times just a few days ago, we read a very disturbing story about a Indonesian, I believe, migrant worker who was found in the water tank of her building, and it was discovered when people's water was coming out bubbly of the tap. Maybe you can talk about the Singapore case a little bit.
Unfortunately, Singapore is not, I have not studied Singapore exclusively. My work in Singapore is primarily terrorism in Singapore. So slightly different, although we do have a few workers who have been engaging. I know that it's increasingly a large area, because Singapore is mainly a transit area. It's not usually a destination area, although it ends up being a destination area for human trafficking in some cases, as we've got different districts within Singapore. But it's also very well in the shadows here. Singapore is very good at keeping its secrets quieter. But mainly it's transit, and there are thousands that are transited through here each year because of its central location. But I'm not sure if maybe one of you have encountered more the workers in Singapore, if someone else would like to comment on that.
Yeah. Anyway, this is my PhD area, so maybe I can add a few sentences. Look, the Singapore migration policy is very transparent. It's well developed. It's very sophisticated policy. If we look at the migration policy in East, Southeast, or the Middle East, the Gulf countries, Singapore migration policy is a very transparent, and it has a link with the immigration or population policy as well. We have the three-tier migration policies: very low skilled, then semi-skilled, then high skilled. from the high skill to even the pupilling of Singapore. This is the policy aspect of the migration in Singapore. And and the management aspect of the migrant workers in Singapore is very also open. If you go to the GCC countries, we will see that migrants are put in the camp, and in some countries also, they are not allowed to go to the shopping mall. There are some restrictions in the physical mobility, and I understand the importance of this restriction because it's a huge population, and we can, maybe GCC countries are not, don't afford to allow them move freely and then create the social problems that affect the local population. But in Singapore, scenario is different. They are allowed to move. They have the very free access all over the island, and we know that there is another group of migrants. They are domestic workers. They are female single workers working in Singapore. They have Sunday off, most of them. And also the male workers who are also temporary migrant workers working at the lower end and have also the working day, work off days on Sunday. So there is a little bit, just a little bit. I mean, there are cases of very intimacy relationship, romantic relationships, and that may sometimes turn into a different form because both of the parties know that they are going to stay in Singapore for a short time, and this relation don't end in something else, actually. Yeah. Please, any question from the floor?
Yeah, if it's okay, I had to cut a section from my paper for time. So if we have it, I want to make a couple of points. Is that okay?
Sure.
Because it builds on what you're saying. These are some analytical cautions and conundrums and avenues to pursue, and they're pleas. I think, as many of us have said, we need to disaggregate the rubric of migrant worker. They experience life on the ground very, very differently, and they experience globalization differently. So we shouldn't lump them all together. The Western skilled expatriate lives a life very, very different from the multi-generation workers, from the Badoon, from, some people are documented and unskilled, other people are unskilled and undocumented, and all their experiences are different. But we also need to disaggregate the policymaker. Where does public policy come from? Is it princes? Is it ministers? Technocrats or the private sector? You've disaggregated this to some extent in your work. What's the political logic of decision making? But what I'm saying is at both levels, we need to disaggregate our unit of analysis. I think we do a lot of semantic dancing in our studies of migrant labor. Whether you call them migrants, guest workers, or contractual workers imply different things about the experience. There's an illusion of impermanence that's not real on the ground. Is anybody else troubled by the use of cosmopolitan when we talk about the states of the Gulf and foreign labor? Cosmopolitanism has been used to describe the GCC states. It became a buzzword for Dubai. But in reality, I don't think it's cosmopolitan at all with regard to the treatment of foreign labor. They're subordinated and controlled in too many ways to be truly considered cosmopolitan. But we use that term to dance around this semantically. And finally, this is really nice having the floor at the end. Finally, I think we need to be very cognizant about the nature of distances. I spoke about this a little bit, but across the world, we're seeing the construction of physical barriers, Israel and Palestine, France and the Mediterranean, US and Mexico. We have physical barriers between populations. Balabar talks about virtual fences. And he says a virtual fence is a complex set of differentiated institutions and installations, legislations and procedures and policies. We see both in the Gulf. We see physical fences, these walled living compounds that separate workers from the general population. And then we see Balabar's virtual fence. So we need to be cognizant of the different kinds of fences in migrant labor.
Any last question, please? Okay, if not, then I would like to end the session here, and I'd like to thank all the panelists.
Thank you.
Please, I would like to pass over the mic to Rana, and thank you, Rana, for everything.
When Dr. Hudson and I were working out the conference program, we had these 4 fabulous paper proposals, and so we created this panel for them, and I'm so glad to see them here. I think that this is one of the topics that, like gender, like other topics, is not treated within all our disciplines, and so we have to keep throwing them in people's faces until they are treated within these disciplines. So thank you so much for being here today, and we will reconvene for the next panel, the final panel, at 10 minutes after 4 here in the Tower Ballroom. Thank you.